Welcome, dear friends, to Heritage Hour. I'm grateful you found your way here tonight, or perhaps it's morning where you are, with the kettle just coming to a boil and the windows still silvered with dew. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I ask because stories bridge distance like footbridges over dark water, and the time on your clock will meet the time on mine as we step together into a past that still breathes. Come with me now into a narrow valley with wooden houses huddled close as if for warmth, where the sky is often the color of a stovepipe and the air carries a taste of metal. This is where I grew up, the child of a coal miner in the early 1900s, where the mountains kept their riches under lock and stone, and men like my father paid the fee to open the door with their lungs. Our house stood on a squat of clay just off the main road, the clapboard painted once in a lifetime by some company man who never had to sleep under it. By the time I remember it, the paint had peeled into scales and the roof cried in hard rains. We had 2 rooms down, 2 up, a cook stove that popped with resin, and a front porch where my mother set a pie tin to catch the drips from a leaky seam. The floorboards ran like train tracks from the door to the hearth, and in winter you could see your breath between them if the wind decided to visit. When it howled, the walls shivered and the kerosene lamp guttered, and Mother would set her palm on the glass to steady the flame, as if she could steady the night itself. The world smelled of smoke and soap. Coal smoke, of course, sweet and bitter together, a smell that clung harder than grief, and lye soap rasping at your hands until your knuckles shone raw. On wash days, Mother and I hauled buckets from the pump and filled the copper tub. She stirred shirts and trousers with a stick worn smooth, and the steam turned the kitchen into cloud. She taught me the trick of pressing a collar against the board with just enough force to tame it without cracking the cloth. "Clothes are a man's second skin," she said. "If the first is worn from work, let the second at least be clean." When I was small enough to sit inside the tub, I pretended it was a steamboat and sang to the hiss of water against iron. By the time I was 10, I stood outside with sleeves rolled and wrists burning and kept my songs to myself. My father kept his songs too. He was a quiet man, straight as a tent pole when he left in the morning, bent as a comma when he returned. His boots slept by the door like 2 black dogs, coal ground into the creases so deep that no brush could raise it. He had careful hands, broad in the palm but delicate in the tips, the way a man's hands learn to be when a careless touch can bring a ceiling down. Every evening he laid his lamp on the table as if it were an egg that might hatch. He would oil the wick, wipe the glass with a square of flour sack that Mother kept folded in the drawer for that purpose alone, and he would look at the flame in a way I later recognized as prayer. Sometimes, after he'd eaten, he turned to the Bible and read a verse or 2. He sounded out the names of places as if he might travel there by speaking them, though his feet went only in 2 directions, down the road to the mine mouth at dawn and back again at dusk if mercy held. We lived by the whistle's breath. It blew in the morning, a long, low call that pulled men from beds like a tide. It blew for the midday break, dull and short. It blew in the evening when the day's digging was done. It blew differently too when something bad happened. Not the neat arithmetic of start and stop, but an animal sound that made every head lift, every hand go still, a sound that untied laces and unbuttoned courage. 3 winters before I was born, the mine had collapsed on a Sunday when the night shift ran late. Sometimes when the wind was right, our neighbor Mrs. Larkin swore she could still hear the whistle from that day threaded through the trees, a thin cry that never learned it was over. For food we had what could be stretched. Cornmeal stirred until it grinned, biscuits that tasted like air unless Mother coaxed them with a thumbprint of molasses, potatoes boiled in their jackets, beans that ticked like tiny tin clocks against the pot. Every now and then we had bacon ends fried in a black skillet and the kitchen filled with perfume. If the company store had a surprise, we'd bring home a wedge of cheese wrapped in paper like a gift, and we'd slice it thin and slow to make the moment louder. On birthdays, the celebration looked like a second biscuit and someone telling a story on the porch, while the dusk came on with fireflies like little lamps. We chewed and listened, and hunger became a polite guest who knew to keep quiet. School was a white building with a bell hung on a rope the teacher had to pull herself. and the chalk dust there tasted cleaner than the dust outside. The boys came with cold dawn still on their collars, and the girls with their hair tight and teeth chattering in winter. We learned our letters, which felt like finding keys, and our numbers, which felt like counting out prayer beads. Some days I went, some I didn't. When Mother needed me, I stayed to help, and I learned different lessons. How to stretch a stew with water without drowning its courage. How to turn a worn sheet so the thin spot lived under your feet instead of under your back. How to splice a rope. How to listen for the small, sure latest sound of a thing coming undone. The company store felt like a church without forgiveness. The counters shone with tins whose labels wore bright colors we could not afford. You paid with scrip, little metal coins stamped with the company's seal, and the man behind the ledger never looked at you, only at the numbers marching into debt. We brought back flour in sacks, sewn shut with string. And when they were empty, Mother boiled the string to soften it and used it to bind things at home. The knots so neat I swear you could have tied the wind with them if she asked it nicely. At the back of the store stood a barrel of pickles you could smell from the door. And sometimes, if my work at the tipple had earned a few honest pennies, I would buy one and eat it in slow bites on the walk home, tongue smarting, eyes watering. The sour brightness like remembering summer in the teeth of November. I first went to work just shy of 12, turning slate at the breaker. They called us breaker boys, though some had lines on their foreheads as if worry had moved in early. We sat on planks with the coal running beneath us like dark water and plucked out slate with our fingers. The slate had a different sound, a dry clack against the boards, and a different feel, sharper and colder, as though it remembered being the shell of something. The coal cut your nails to black half-moons and set your throat to coughing until the blood in your spit looked like rust. A foreman with a hat that had never seen the inside of a mine watched us from a high walk. And every so often he rapped a rod against the railing hard enough to make your nerves jump and say, without words, faster. We ate our lunches, bread a smear of lard, cold tea in a bottle sealed with a cork, on piles of culm while the wind sprinkled grit in our mouths, and we told jokes with the elegance of the hungry, which is to say, we laughed at anything that might be persuaded to be funny. At home, I became an older sister early. My brother Eli had eyes the color of sky after rain and a laugh like a handbell, bright and sudden. He followed me like a duckling, his hand warm in mine even when the rest of him ran cold. My baby sister May was born when the cabbage in the garden was still young and tender, a squalling scrap of red-faced protest that turned into a round-cheeked miracle by Christmas. Mother packed her out to the line in a sling and pegged shirts while the baby slept against her chest, breath steady as a metronome. The sight of Mother's shirt darkened by milk at the shoulder made me feel a holiness I didn't know how to name. We had little, but we had the small proofs of life continuing. Winter taught patience and other slow arts. We stuffed rags in the window seams and curled like commas on the bed to keep each other's feet warm. Father came home with ice on his lashes from the night shift, his breath a cloud in the kitchen until the stove caught. He would rub his hands with a piece of tallow and hold them out to the glow like a man making an oath. The snow in our valley went gray in a day, coal ash drifting down like a second weather. When we walked to Sunday service, our boots left ghost prints that filled with cinders by the time we walked home. Still, in the church, the windows tried to keep blue, and the preacher's voice grew warm as it climbed. We sang from hymnals with frayed corners, and when the small choir hit a sweet note on Rock of Ages, I felt the floor steady itself beneath us all. One late afternoon, when the light had the color of old honey and the chill sneaked up your sleeves, the whistle blew that animal note. Men running looked different than boys running. Shorter steps, arms tight, speed tempered by calculation. And all at once they were in the road in that particular silence that happens before a scream when everyone holds their breath at once. Mother grabbed May as she came through the door and lined us up by the window. "Stay," she said. Voice steady the way a blade is steady, and then she was gone, her shawl rising behind her like a wing. I stood with Eli and watched hat after hat, lamp after lamp, pass toward the mine mouth, and time slowed into a chew that wouldn't go down. Father came home before midnight, walking as if each step weighed more than the last. His face wore the deep charcoal that only tragedy can grind in. He went to the bowl, poured water and scrubbed as if he could erase the day. When he turned, his eyes were red-shot but dry. "Sam Weller," he said, and the name sat in the middle of the room like a chair no one had the heart to move. "Ruth took him, quick!" Mother stood with May on her hip, her mouth a flat line, and nodded once. She crossed the room and laid her hand against Father's cheek and left there a pale print like the mark of a kiss from a ghost. We weren't kin to the Wellers, but the next morning she put a loaf and a jar of beans in her basket and brought it across town and set it on the Wellers' table without fuss. "For supper," she said. They had a photograph of Sam, his wedding picture, with the eyes rubbed thin from touching. Mrs. Weller kept picking up the frame and setting it down as if she might move him to a better seat. After that, the days acquired a new angle. I learned to listen for the creak in wood that meant weight where no weight should be. Father showed me his helmet, leather gone soft from sweat, lamp clip polished by thumb, and the way the flame burned truest when the air was good and flickered when it meant to warn you. "It tells you the news," he said. "You just have to read its hand." He told me, too, that fear came in two flavors, the kind that made you careful and the kind that made you foolish. You had to learn to drink the first and pour the second away. I began to understand that courage was not a shout but a habit. The way you tied your bootlaces, the way you checked your lamp, the way you handed your bread to a man who'd come up from the dark with nothing in his hands but his heartbeat. Spring came late that year, but when it finally decided to be generous, it did so quickly. The hills went from brown to green in a week, and the creek, muddy with melt, threw itself around stones like a pup. We planted a skinny garden behind the house, beans, cabbages, onions, a row of carrots that looked like punctuation. The seeds rang in the tin like dry rain, and when I buried them in the furrows we had scratched with a hoe, I felt rich in the way of kings hiding gold. Eli stood with a stick and guarded the plot as though a strolling crow were an invading army. It was the first summer I remember with pleasure more than worry, because Father's cough, though it lived with us like an uncle who never left, quieted when the days warmed and Mother's cheeks caught a little rose. On the 4th of July, the company put on a picnic that smelled like politics. They gave the men hot dogs in buns and boys bottles of sarsaparilla with the caps still on, and for an hour, everyone pretended we were a town made of cotton candy. A brass band played a march that roused something old and simple inside me, and Father, who never danced, tapped his boot on the dust. I stood with my bottle in both hands and felt the fizz for the first time, the bubbles popping up my nose, and I laughed so hard I scared a dog. During the speeches, the superintendent said we were family, which was a brave thing to say given that family was the one thing we had that he couldn't ledger. But he said it, and cheers went up, because cheers are easier than silence when someone in a hat is looking at you. When the fireworks came, small and polite, I felt the belly-deep joy of watching the sky surprise itself, even as the ash drifted down like a reminder. When autumn returned, I went below ground for the first time. I had begged and bargained and sworn to mind every word of any man older than me. I think Father hoped to keep me out longer, but we had a run of bills that stacked like a crooked wall. And when the mine boss asked, he didn't ask so much as assumed. And I was glad, afraid but glad, to be taken seriously by the world for once. The cage rattled us down through ribs of timber wrapped with sagging wire, and I felt my ears pop, as if the earth was swallowing us with a careful throat. The air turned from everyday air to a different species, wet, slightly sour, more a texture than a taste. Our lamps threw cones of yellow that thinned the dark but never defeated it. The first time you hear a pick echo through a pillar, it sets up house in your bones. My job was a nipper at first, fetching wedges and spikes, running small errands along the track, watching for the mules' ears pricking in warning. The mules were smarter than most men and twice as patient. They knew the difference between a good roof and a bad one, and if a mule stiffened at a doorway, we backed up without argument and sent for the boss. The men taught me to listen for the language of the mine, the soft rain sound of trickling water that could mean a pocket ready to break through, the low groan of timber remembering the forest it came from. The dusty whisper that meant a fall was thinking hard about becoming a fact. I learned to spit black and keep talking. I learned to tuck my fear behind my teeth and keep it there until I got home, where I could open my mouth to the night and let it out in a sigh on the porch. At home, I held on to small luxuries like talismans. A bit of ribbon someone had left on a fence. The smooth pebble that looked like an egg I found by the creek. The book of poems a traveling mission woman pressed into my hand when I stood in the church doorway, looking more curious than faithful. I read by lamplight until my eyes broke open in tears and the words ran. Then I read more, because the lines of verse felt like ladders in a place with only tunnels. Mother humored me, and even father, who thought all words should work for their salt, asked me sometimes to read a piece aloud. He would sit with his elbows on his knees and stare at the floorboards, as if he could see straight through them to the roots. And when I finished, he'd say, "That's a good one," without explaining the how of it. We didn't need to say why. It was enough to share the silence after the words with 3 or 4 breaths, a shade easier than the ones before. We had neighbors who embroidered our days with their own threads. The Larkins, 2 doors down, had a boy named Jack who could whistle through 2 fingers loud enough to call a train. He taught me to walk rail without falling, arms out, eyes soft, the trick more in the mind than in the feet. Old Mr. Zielinski carved little birds out of coal on his days above and gave them to children as if they were the easiest thing in the world to make. Though I never could whittle one that didn't end up looking like a lump apologizing for itself. He said the blackbirds flew better at night where no one could see their wings. If you listened hard, you could hear them, he said, pecking stars clean. I believed him longer than I'd admit later. Then came the year of fever. It started with a dry cough in a house by the creek and ran faster than a child. Within a week, every house had a blanket hung in the window that meant "don't come." The preacher walked the road with a wet rag over his mouth and eyes like burnt lamps. We boiled handkerchiefs and washed doorknobs with vinegar and crossed ourselves in the way of our mother tongues, whether the sign was ours or not. Father still went below because the earth does not catch a fever the way we do. Or if it does, it has learned to hide it better. Eli took sick first. He lay hot and stubborn, cheeks lit with the same fierce color he had when he ran too long. "I'm not going to die," he told me, more a command than a promise. "No one's dying in this house." I sat next to him and soaked a cloth, and May slept in a basket at the foot of the bed and breathed like a cat. Mother's hands moved like the hands of a clock with too much to tell, steady even when they shook. We cupped water into Eli's dry mouth and watched and waited, as if patience alone could change the way a road turns. He got better in 3 days, then worse for 2, then better again. The kind of better that means you don't look away from him when you turn to stir the pot. When he stood up, the house applauded with the softest sound, everyone inhaling at once and letting it go slow. We lost others. You could count the losses by the Sundays when the church filled with black coats and the graveyard took a new square of turf, like a quilt you never wanted to finish. The mine whistled steady through it, as though sorrow were only a shift to be worked. And the company man in town wore the same hat as always and tipped it the same way when he went by in his wagon. The horse switching its tail as if it had an opinion and an oath to keep. The fever did what disasters do in small places. It made us mean in flashes and then kinder than saints the rest of the time. We brought soup and set it on porches without knocking. We quarreled over nothing and forgave before bedtime because the morning's work required the kind of together that resentments fray. We prayed harder and more secretly. We slept light. I grew in that season, not taller so much as tougher in the places that don't show. The mind took me into actual work then, shoveling, setting props, loading. My shoulders learned to ache in a language I understood, and my hands grew calluses that looked like little islands. The older men told stories to fill the dark, about strikes in other towns, and men who stood up as if their spines were iron, and others who bent and broke and mended into straighter versions of themselves in the end. They spoke of unions in low voices, looking over their shoulders at nothing, and every man held his words the way you hold a match in wind. I learned that hope itself is a kind of contraband, smuggled in your coat lining and shared in whispers among those who need it most. A turning point came with a letter. It was a rare thing to receive one, rarer still for it to be addressed to me. The envelope wore my name in careful script, and inside was a note from a teacher who had passed through our town a year earlier, a man with spectacles that flashed like fish scales when he laughed. He had remembered the girl who read poems as if she was starving for them and told me there might be a place, if I could get myself there, in a normal school 2 towns over, a training place for teachers. There was no money, only the possibility of a scholarship if I could outwrite girls whose families had time and tablecloths. I held the letter like a piece of glass. I showed it to Mother first. She read it with her lips moving, then read it again, then set it on the table as if it might run away. Father came in with grit on his collar and took the paper in hands that had pulled men from caves, and I watched his face take it in. The hope, the insult of hope, the pride, the math. He put the letter back in its envelope and tucked it into the Bible. "It's a good thing to be seen," he said, then looked at me a long time. "We'll think." We thought for weeks. Thinking in our house meant doing figures out loud and seeing if the numbers agreed not only with themselves, but with the beating in our chests. It meant imagining what would happen if I went and the stove burned lower and Eli had to take my spot at the breaker earlier than he should. It meant considering whether a girl like me had a right to want something that asked other people to carry the part I laid down. It meant asking whether a girl like me could go out into a world that had never cared much if we had light or not, and ask it for a window. I lay awake and traced cracks in the ceiling and listened to the mice like tiny carpenters in the walls and thought of chalk dust and apples, wrapped in paper in teachers' desks and the feel of a room where the only dark is the space between words. In the end, life made the choice for us. Work slowed. A seam failed. Men were let go and brought back and let go again. We owed at the store, and Mother was down 2 customers for washing because one family had moved and the other lay sick. Father's cough grew sticky. One morning, he could not stop to breathe long enough to tie his boots, and he sat on the edge of the bed and made a sound I had heard from beams that were going to break. He didn't go in that day, and he didn't go in the next. Pride can be a roof, but it's a poor raincoat. When the weather turns truly bad, you need a real one. So we kept the letter in the Bible, and I kept going down, and we told each other that not going now didn't mean never. It meant not yet. I believed it the way you believe in spring during February, because if you don't, you might go mad. Yet even in that choosing, no, in that not choosing, I found a kind of brightness. We started a little lending circle among the women, 3 cents a week. The pot going round the houses and lifting each in turn over the bump. Mother ran it with the precision of a steam whistle and the stern compassion of a nurse. Men laughed and called it a hen party until the day the circle paid for a doctor at one house and burial clothes at another. And after that, the laughter turned into nods that looked like thanks. On Sundays, between hymns, Mother whispered the order of the next weeks to me, and I filed it with the same importance I gave to the map in Father's head that told him where the best rooms of coal slept. I remember one evening in particular, the kind that writes itself into your bones. The sky had the purplish light that comes just before a storm, and the smell of rain was an ache behind the eyes. I was walking home from a long shift, lamp still hanging at my hip, when the first big drops started slapping the dust into dark coins. By the time I hit our steps, the road was a river, and I stood under the porch roof listening to the world get washed. Mother had set bread to rise, and the living room smelled like yeast, a smell that to this day means safety to me. Father was whittling a peg for a loose leg on a chair. May was coloring on a scrap with a borrowed stub of blue pencil, and Eli was trying to make his hair lie flat with water. I stood dripping and loved them with a greed that embarrassed me. Loved them the way a miner loves fresh air or a mule loves his own stall. The storm passed in a clap and a hiss, and when it was over, everything shone, the leaves, the road, the window glass, the small coin of the lamp flame. Sometimes all a life needs to feel full is for the dust to settle. Work took and gave in measures we didn't get to choose. Christmas arrived with a chicken from the company, a mealy orange from a church in the city, and a pair of socks knit by a ladies' auxiliary who must have prayed over their needles. Father carved a whistle for Eli and a needle case for Mother and a hair comb for me, smooth as water. We gathered around the stove and told the same stories we always told and laughed in the same places, which felt like proof that we still knew the right names for things. That night I woke to the sound of Father coughing, a long, tearing fit that made the bed sing. And I went to the kitchen and warmed water and held his back. He was embarrassed to be tended like that by the child he had carried on his shoulders once to see the circus train. "It's only a tickle," he said when he could speak. I said, "Then let's soothe it," and that made him smile despite himself. And he drank and slept, and I sat in the chair and watched the little blue hole in the stove turn red and said a prayer in plain words. The next year brought a strike in a town 2 valleys over, and for 2 weeks the men here were restless as dogs before a storm. They gathered in 2s and 3s, heads drawn close, and the air between them seemed to carry sparks. Father kept his counsel. I knew he had no love for the men in the office with their clean cuffs and their greyhound eyes. But he had lived long enough to know that hard moves had hard prices, and he weighed things on a scale more careful than mine. When the strike ended bloody, he went to work the next morning with his lunch pail and his quiet. He kissed Mother on the forehead, which he did not always do, and he told me to mind the lamp. The shadow of what had happened fell softly over our town like dusk after a clear day. And though everything looked exactly the same, we walked a little nearer to one another on the road. Years work their will even on the stubborn. Eli grew into his shoulders and into his laugh, which got deeper without losing its surprise. May learned to braid hair and saved scraps of bright cloth in a cigar box and stitched them into a doll so fine that other girls asked to hold it like a baby. I read the Bible and the poems and anything that came wrapped around glass or canned peaches, and I tried to write in ways that made the pages smell like soap and lamp oil, like our lives. Sometimes I caught Father reading the letter in the Bible, his finger resting under the words as if he could lift them like a plank and see if anything useful lay beneath. Once he looked up and found me watching. "You'll do it," he said. "Not today, but you'll do it. The trick is to keep a plan in your pocket even on the days you're wearing your worst pair of pants." That made me laugh, and the laugh stuck to the sentence, so I remember it always together. Pants and plans, hope and holes. Then came the day the mountain shifted. We were midway through a week of humid heat that made the air feel like laundry not yet dry. The timbers in number 4 had been complaining for days, but the foreman wrote the squealing down as if a complaint could become smaller by living on paper. Around noon I was running a message when I felt the floor twitch under my feet. A sound like a book slammed shut by a giant hand ran down the pillar. Lamps faltered, then rallied. Men froze, then moved at once, each to his already decided task. I saw Father ahead of me, shoulders squared, mouth set in that line he wore when the day meant business. He was helping 2 younger men set a prop where the roof had started to belly like bread left too long. Someone shouted. Then the mountain made up its mind. It is a strange thing the way a fall happens, slow and sudden, quiet and loud. A breath, and the world becomes a different building without telling you which door to use. The air punched out of the room and back in. Dust blossomed like an evil flower. The light turned brown. Sound turned to wool. The prop took the first insult and broke, and the roof came down with the inexorable politeness of authority. Father shoved one man, then the other, and the shove saved them. The second shove cost. When the rubble settled, he was nowhere and everywhere at once. The ground, the air, the ache. We dug with hands and boards and a purpose that felt like a song. A man with a voice like gravel organized the digging into squares, and we called and listened and called again. The dust in our mouths tasted like copper, and the lamps guttered and hung on. It took the length of an old prayer to find him, and by then there was a stillness about him that made the word Father feel like a story someone had once told me. His face was peaceful, as if something had finally gone right, which felt like a joke I wasn't ready to hear. They carried him up wrapped in canvas, and the sun on his hands looked obscene. Men took off their caps, and women stood on their porches with aprons twisted into ropes in their fists. Mother met us at the gate with her chin high. She did not cry then. She thanked the men with a nod that told them their mercy had been counted and would be repaid in meals, and mended seams and prayers whispered at night with their names inside them. She touched Father's cheek, and then turned to the children and gathered us with her gaze as if we were wash on the line and a storm threatened. We laid him out on the table and fetched the preacher and the neighbor women who knew the business of death like a trade, and the house filled with the soft sounds of kindness. Water poured, cloth folded, feet careful on the floor. The days that followed came in pairs, things to be done and the time between them. There was the choosing of a suit, the writing of a notice, the digging of a hole, and then there were the hours that lay like unpaved roads you didn't know how to walk. People came by with casseroles and words that were the right words even if they hardly touched the wound. We watched the light move across the room and spoke of him in small sentences that held big meanings. Eli stood taller and smaller at once. May asked where he had gone, and I told her a truth that had more hope in it than geography. Mother folded his shirts one last time and put them in a chest, setting cedar shavings between them as if moths could eat a memory. When we put him in the ground, the preacher said ashes and dust, and for once the words felt perfectly chosen and perfectly wrong. The men filled the hole as gently as men can fill a hole, and the sound of dirt on wood is still the sound my heart makes on certain nights when the wind has that particular edge to it. Grief took up a chair in the house and sat with us, not always speaking but impossible not to notice. The first morning after, the whistle blew and the map of the town tried to rearrange itself without him walking across it, and nothing quite fit. The mine offered us a gesture, a small pension that looked large in a room of empty bowls and smaller under the sky. The company storeman tipped his hat with something like actual sorrow in his eyes, and for 2 months the ledger's numbers were kinder. Mother went back to washing sooner than anyone wanted her to. Not because she was made of stone, but because the world is not fooled by tears. I went down again, slower, and every timber looked like a question I couldn't answer. If this were the sort of story with saints who made it easy, I would tell you that I found a way to stop aching quickly and neatly. But I am telling you a life. The ache learned new shapes. It became the habit of placing an extra cup on the table and then catching yourself, moving it without fuss. It became the way you turned to say something and stopped in the turning. It became the way you listened harder to Eli's laugh, because you now knew a laugh could leave a house and take up elsewhere. But it also became something else, a kind of second sight for small mercies. A neighbor boy left flowers stolen from his mother's garden, well-meaning theft in a fist made clumsy by kindness. A customer paid mother in cash, not scrip. The teacher with the letter sent another, this time with 2 lines only. Still here. Still thinking of you. Sometimes love is the insistence of a stamp. So I made myself a promise in words as plain as beans. I would keep us fed and warm, and I would keep the plan in my pocket even if the pocket had a hole. I read in the evenings, not to escape, but to build a better vocabulary for the next set of hurts. I wrote in a cheap notebook lined in blue, not with poems now, but with pieces of our day. What the sky looked like when the smoke broke. How the mine sounded when the men sang on a bet. The smell of soap and sorrow mixed on a Sunday. I thought that if I wrote it all down, I would be giving witness to the men like father who disappeared into statistics the way coal disappears into fire. All usefulness, no monument. Writing felt like lifting a lamp at the mouth of the tunnel and keeping it held a moment longer than necessary so someone behind you could catch up. Work found us, and we found it. Eli took a job in the stables with the mules and came home telling me each animal's temperament as if he'd found a new set of uncles. May started school and brought home letters she'd cut from paper like perfumed snowflakes, pressing them on the walls with paste made from flour and pride. Mother learned to fix shoes as well as scrub shirts, and neighbors began to come by with boots that needed new soles and the kind of gratitude that pays in gossip and favors when cash is thin. The house, which had seemed to shrink after father left it, began to fit us again, not like a glove, but like a coat you break in with wear. And then, because life insists on mixing its colors, love came to our street. Not mine, not yet, but a neighbor girl's, Annie Larkins, whose kind eyes had winked over a washtub since we were little. She fell for a boy who had come from the next valley, a boy with a harmonica and a shy way of meeting your gaze. He worked underground but carried in his pocket a dream that smelled like machine oil and possibility. He wanted to go to the city and learn to fix the new motorized engines that were beginning to hum through the world like a second pulse. He had hands that knew talk the way a preacher knows verses. When he stood in our kitchen, his hat in his hand, speaking of a school he'd heard of, Mother looked at him the way she had looked at Father's lamp, as if the flame could tell you the news if you were patient. Annie's parents frowned at the ambition and the leaving it implied, but their frowns softened when they saw that love is itself a kind of education. They wed in our church with the blue windows, and when the choir tried for that sweet note, they reached it so pure I felt my ribs widen. Watching them, I felt my own heart knock softly, asking whether it could have such things and whether it had any business asking. I was older than many girls married already, but my days were full and my sleep was tired, and I did not know how to carry something as delicate as love into rooms filled with coal dust. Still, sometimes walking home at dusk, I would imagine a hand finding mine at the top of the hill, the two of us carrying the day between us like a bucket, sharing the weight, laughing when it sloshed. I imagined telling someone the entire set of small facts that made up my hours and having him listen like a man reading the face of his lamp. The year turned again. The company decided to electrify part of the mine, and men came in with tools that looked like science fiction, coils and wires, and a confidence that made the old hands mutter. The smell underground changed slightly, a sharper note under the dampness, and the light in certain chambers grew steadier, less like candles in a wind, more like something that believed in itself. We learned new ways to be careful, new ways to get hurt. A man can be wounded by progress as surely as by a fall, but the biters bit faster, and loads rose heavier, and wages stayed as they were, which is to say barely enough to argue with hunger. The ledger at the store suffered no improvements by wire. I kept saving, coins in a tin, folded bills when a miracle visited, and I took to walking past the train station on my day above ground just to stand near tracks that went somewhere. Men in hats looked at schedules like fortunes, and the station master kept a pencil behind his ear and a stub of tobacco rolling in his cheek like a small thundercloud. I would stand and smell coal smoke that did not come from our mine and feel a twitch in my bones that said road. I would then go home by the creek and wash my hands and hang laundry and make soup and write 3 sentences in the notebook, the twitch settling into words that looked back at me like steady eyes. When the first anniversary of Father's passing came, I wrote a promise in my notebook. I would go to that school even if it took me 10 years. I would teach reading to boys who'd never seen their names written neat. I would bring books that smelled like hope and chalk, that drew lines straighter than the tunnels we dug. I would say his name, my father's name, out loud to any room that would have it and to rooms that wouldn't too. The promise sat in the notebook like a coin I could spend later. Later came sooner than I thought, though not the way I expected. The mine cut hours again, then men, and with less pay and more worry. The company school's scholarship suddenly widened its arms. Mrs. Sutter, the mission woman with the traveling library, wrote a letter in her determined hand, the kind of hand that could have threaded a needle in a windstorm. She wrote that I had a place if I could arrive by the first Monday in October with 2 dresses, a pair of serviceable shoes, and a pencil case. The tuition would be forgiven if I agreed to teach 2 years in any school that would have me, mountain, holler, prairie, any place with children and a door. We sorted the house with the calm of a family used to moving mountains a teaspoon at a time. Mother took in 3 extra baskets of laundry a week to cover what the scholarship did not. I hemmed my best dress and turned the collar of another and polished my shoes with tallow until they shone like patient beetles. Eli sold a set of tin soldiers he'd loved since he was little and bought me a second-hand satchel whose leather smelled of sermons. May tucked a blue ribbon in the pocket. Mother folded a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese into a cloth and tied it like a sailor's knot. We stood at the station and breathed the smell of departures, and when the train pulled in, everyone's face went composed in that way faces do when they are about to be brave. The ride itself felt like a story told by a different mouth. The windows offered up farms and mills, and the backs of houses with wash hanging and women's arms swinging like metronomes. In my lap lay the satchel heavier than it looked because it carried the plan. I arrived in a town with a courthouse that had a clock, and I found the school by asking 3 people and following the sound of a bell that believed in itself. My room at the boarding house was narrow and clean, with a bed made high with quilts and a washstand that winked back my nervous face in its chipped picture. I set my 2 dresses in the closet and placed the ribbon May had given me on the table. And for a long minute I felt like a person I had met once in a dream and liked. School was work of a different sort, but work nonetheless. Books that talked about books. Chalk that grated the board into a squeak that made my teeth shiver. A practice class of small children with noses that ran and voices that rose like birds when they learned a new word. I learned to write lesson plans in a tidy hand and to clap a rhythm that pulled a room back into itself. I learned that a room of children can smell when you are afraid, and that the cure for fear, in teaching as in mining, is to show up with your lamp trimmed and your eyes open. In letters home, I tried not to sound like boasting, but pride leaks through even careful words, and I let it, because it seemed unfair to lock it up after all the years it had been hungry. I did not forget the mine. On holidays, I rode home with a knot in my throat that loosens only when you glimpse your own street. Each time the town looked both smaller and braver. Eli had gained a man's walk without losing a boy's kindness. May could read her own name and mine, and she said them in a way that made them sound like 2 bright things caught in the same net. Mother's hair had gone more grey, and her hands had turned into maps of every chore they had conquered. We ate bread and beans and laughed. On Sundays we went to Father's grave and told him the small news, as if the small news were the only kind that mattered. When I finished school, the county sent me to a 1-room schoolhouse at the edge of the next valley, a building with a stove that sulked and a bell that rang like a spoon against a jar. My students arrived with faces chapped from wind and hands already calloused by chores that didn't wait for childhood to end. We learned letters and numbers and the history of rivers and the poetry of snow. I hung maps that promised the world had corners beyond our own. And I drew lines on the board and told the children those lines could be ladders if they wanted them to be. We kept the stove fed with split wood and the room fed with sentences. Sometimes I would hold a book and feel Father's hand steadying mine, the way he had steadied a lamp. And I would read louder than the weather outside. But a life does not sort itself into chapters as neatly as a school book. The mind drew us all like a tide, even when we found work elsewhere. Eli came to me one evening with his cap in his hands and a look on his face that was not fear, not exactly, but a respect for danger you only learn by looking it in the eye. He had been offered a chance to go down proper, more pay, more pride, more risk. "I can do it," he said, not bragging, just reading the facts. "I know the mule's language and I know the timber's complaints. And there's May and there's Mother. I can do it." I looked at him and saw Father at that age, the same set to the mouth, the same steadiness that made you want to lean against him when the road tilted. I wanted to say no with the ferocity of a storm. Instead, I said, "Mind the lamp." And then I put my hand to his cheek and felt the scratch of the day there. And I kissed his brow as if I could coin a blessing that would spend itself only in favor. He did well, which is to say he came home each night with his hands whole and his breath his own. He saved small, often, the way a man builds a wall against weather you can smell but cannot see on the horizon. He courted a girl named Nora, who worked in the dry goods store and knew the price of every bolt of cloth without looking. They walked together in the evenings, 2 figures moving through a town that had watched too many love stories end early and therefore watched this one with the kind of attention that could be mistaken for worry. They married in spring, when the sycamores put on leaves like a strong opinion, and Nora moved into the room Eli had kept neat as a barracks. Mother's smile that day had grief braided into it like a ribbon, and joy too. Another ribbon, and the braiding made a pattern I still see when I close my eyes. I taught, and I visited, and I wrote by lamplight in the evenings when the world was quiet enough to hear the pencil speak. I wrote about bread and boots and bells and the way work teaches a person the exact weight of a day. I wrote about the smell of coal, yes, coal again, as if I could write it out of my lungs, and the sound of a mule's exhale in a tight place. I wrote about boys in my class whose fathers were ghosts at the dinner table. Not because they were dead, but because they were tired beyond the reach of talk. I did not write much about love, not then, though I suppose it was there the whole time, like yeast in a dough, working on everything even when no one was watching. It found me anyway. We met by accident, which is how the truest things often arrive. A young mechanic named Thomas came to the school one winter to fix the stove damper after it stuck open and filled the room with smoke that wrote its own lessons on the air. He had hands that could coax iron to change its mind, and a laugh that came easily, like water finding downhill. He listened when I spoke, all the way to the end of the sentence. And when he spoke, he left room on each side of his words for someone else to live there. He didn't mind, but he wasn't afraid of the dark. He had worked nights in a rail yard and knew the sound of distance and the weight of a silent hour. We walked together after that, slow through the thin snow that squeaked like unvarnished truth under our boots. He told me his mother had died when he was small, and he had learned to iron shirts and stew beans and patch socks with a patience that translated to machinery later. He said he liked the way a thing fit when it was fixed proper. That click you feel in your bones when two pieces agree. He asked to meet Mother, not as a formality but as a step. And when he stood in our kitchen with his cap crushed between his hands, she looked at him as if she were reading a complicated word in a familiar book. "Sit," she said. And he did. And she put a cup of coffee in front of him and asked about tools and about how he knew when a bearing would go. And he answered in a language she understood, the language of hands and caution and respect. After he left, she set the cup in the dishpan and said, "He is careful, and in our house." That was the highest kind of praise. We married in a summer that smelled like rain on hot dust and moved into an upstairs room over a shop where the floor told the truth about the years with every footstep. We didn't have much, but much is a relative word. We had a bed with quilts Mother had sewn. We had 2 plates and 2 spoons, and we had a kettle that sang like a friend. In the evenings, Thomas came home with the day on him. Oil, heat, the metallic sweetness of filings. And I came home with chalk on my palms and children's voices folded into my hair, and we told each other everything. When we were poor, we told it. When we got a little ahead, we told that too. He built me a bookshelf from planks that had been something else once, and I filled it slowly, each volume a guest we were happy to feed. The mine went on. It always does until it doesn't. Some years it gave like a neighbor with a good garden. Others it took like a taxman who'd been given a quota. Eli and Nora had a baby boy they named James, for the grandfather he would know only by stories. James's first laugh came like a door opening in a house that had already been beautiful and suddenly had another room. I held him and felt the future in my arms, heavier than you'd think. And I whispered to him the names of every tool in the schoolhouse and every bird that nested in our valley, as if naming could build a fence against hurt. Thomas and I, well, we tried for a baby too, and for a while the trying was all there was. The quiet after hope is a thing you must learn to carry. And we learned together. We asked doctors and we prayed, and then we stopped asking and prayed differently, and then we went back to asking because stopping felt like a kind of loss we weren't ready to inventory. Time did its work on our disappointment until it changed shape from a hole into a space where other things could be built. We became the aunt and uncle who always had time, the ones who knew which toy a child really wanted to hold and which story needed telling twice. My students, well, you don't say it out loud in a schoolhouse, but the truth is some of them became the children of my heart. When I stood at the front of the room and looked out, I saw a row of possible roads the world might take, and I loved each one like a traveler loves the first mile. Years slipped their skins and left them hung on nails for us to marvel at. May grew into a young woman with hands nimble as swallows, and she made dresses that fit like promises. She caught the eye of a clerk who kept ledgers straight enough to use as mirrors, and they built a life that used numbers as if they were bricks. Mother aged with a gravity that made me want to stand up straighter in her presence. She learned to rest, a skill she had never had time for, and when she rested, she placed her hands in her lap like 2 birds finally at ease. She never remarried. "I'm busy," she'd say, and by busy she meant living, telling stories, remembering good jokes, and serving biscuits that tasted like the version of childhood you hope is true. Then the mind took its due again. It did not collapse this time. It did what sometimes hurts more. It made men old early and sent them home in coughs. Eli's breath shortened at the edges, as if the day's map had shrunk and the road to bed had become a climb. He ignored it, which is a form of faith common among men who are needed by others. By winter, the cough had a rattle that sounded like unlucky dice. We found a doctor who was young enough to be earnest and old enough to be kind, and he told us what we already knew, that long work in dark air writes its name on a man's lungs the way smoke writes on a ceiling. We propped pillows and brewed syrups and listened to him sleep in the chair because lying down felt like drowning. Nora learned to read his breath the way a midwife reads a contraction. There were better days, and we were clever enough to make 2 celebrations out of each one, the day itself and the memory of it in the next day's telling. He took a bad turn one Sunday when the sky looked like tin hammered thin. We sat around him and told stories as if words could hold him to the chair. He smiled in the places where a smile was the only reply that mattered. When the evening lamp was lit, he asked me to read. I chose the passage I knew he liked, the one about the valley and the shadow and the rod and the staff. Words worn smooth by use but still somehow sharp where needed. He closed his eyes and nodded, and took a breath that did not promise another. When it came, it was small. When it didn't, we were already touching him, already telling him it was all right in voices we hoped were larger than our fear. He went the way tired men sometimes go, like a man who has carried a 100-pound sack to the top of a hill, and then finally sets it down. Grief returned, but it was a different grief this time, less of a hammer, more of a tide. We let it come and go, and we built our days around caring for Nora and for little James, who had grown tall while no one was looking and looked at the world with his father's cautious affection. He followed Thomas into the shop sometimes and learned how to listen to a wrench, how to look for the hairline crack that tells the future. Mind the lamp, I would say out of habit when he left the house. And then I would laugh because I was telling a mechanic a miner's prayer, and he would laugh because love is mostly the repurposing of language into a better tool. I kept teaching. The school grew by a room, then 2, and we purchased a proper bell on a rope that didn't sound like a jar anymore. Children came with new names and old stories, but the stories had a different tone now. Their parents had heard whispers of places you could go for wages that didn't require a lamp, and a few families went, which left the town thinner but not yet empty. I started a little library in the corner, a shelf grown to 2 to 5 to a wall. We stamped each book with a blue stamp that bled just enough to look like a living thing. And I taught older boys how to mend spines with paste and muslin, and they were as proud of a repaired book as they were of a repaired boot. Thomas and I grew older too, which is a gift disguised as arithmetic. He built me a garden fence out back of the school, and I planted beans and nasturtiums and one stubborn rose that refused to die no matter how rude the winters. We ate tomatoes warm from sun and drank coffee on the stoop and named constellations we got wrong but loved anyway. We argued a little and apologized a lot and learned to take turns being the brave one. He carried a photo of us that May had taken with a borrowed camera, and the picture was a little blurry, which made me like it more. It proved we were moving even when we thought we were holding still. I went home to Mother every Sunday I could. We cooked together, our elbows knocking, our jokes old enough to be true. We visited Father and Eli at the cemetery and said the small news. We didn't clean the stones more than was needed. We liked them a little mossy, as if time were allowed to have its say. Sometimes I would sit on the porch after dishes and write in the notebook, which had become a series of notebooks stacked on a shelf like the rings in a tree. Each one a summer, a winter, the making of a person. There came a day when the mine, the same mine that had measured men all my life, shut its mouth. The company sent a letter written in a hand that looked like a judge's signature. And men stood in the road with the paper in their fists, and an ache that had more to do with identity than with income. Some left then, some stayed and learned other trades. The mule stable turned into a livery for a while, then a garage. The breaker house sat empty, and boys climbed it and shouted into its dark to hear the echo of a past they weren't sure they wanted. The town learned a new set of sounds, hammers on storefronts, a radio in a window, the hard cough of a truck waking at dawn. The air cleared. On certain mornings you could smell something you hadn't smelled since you were a child. Water unadorned, running over stone. I retired from teaching after years that had given me more than I could ever spend. My last class sang to me in voices that cracked in the places sincerity always does, and they gave me a book where each child had written a sentence about what letters had done for them. I kept it on the shelf by my chair and opened it on bad days to remember what a line of print can mean in a life. Mother went one autumn when the leaves had turned the color of rusted pennies, old age claiming her with the courtesy it sometimes shows the deserving. She went at home, in her bed, with her hands folded as if she were praying even after the prayer had been answered. We buried her next to Father and Eli, and the ground looked ordinary and wept anyway. After that, I made a smaller home of our big one, closing off rooms that needed only to keep their memories safe. May visited with her children and their clever talk. Nora came with James and a pie that tasted like her careful heart. And I kept the kettle going like a conversation with the past. Years, more of them than I expected, have laid themselves down behind me, patient as footprints across snowfall. The town is a different place now, neither better nor worse, only changed, with light filtering clean through the mornings in a way that would have made my small self suspicious. Some of the old houses have been mended and painted in colors that would have seemed too hopeful once. Sky, butter, a shade of green that used to exist only in the pages of seed catalogs. Where the company store stood there is a market with chalkboard signs and a jar into which people put coins for families between jobs. The Breaker House is a library now. The first day I walked inside and saw shelves where slate once rattled down, I laughed and cried and had to sit, because my heart didn't know what to do with that much rightness in one room. Sometimes a visitor stops me on the sidewalk and asks if I remember the old days. I tell them I do, that I carry them the way you carry a scar. Most days you forget it's there until you bump it, and then you remember with all your blood. I tell them the old days were not all sorrow, though sorrow had good aim. We had music and beans and jokes and quilts, and we had the habit of sharing the last piece of bread with a kind of ceremony. We had work. We had pride in the making of a day. We had mercy in small bowls. If we had had more, we would have given more. That's how it is with people here. This valley taught me that wealth is not only what you can count, but who will come when you call. On spring evenings, Thomas and I walk to the hill above the graveyard and sit where the grass remembers who loves it. We watch the sun smolder down into the trees, and we listen to the town shift from the day's noise to the night's. He still carries a wrench in his pocket sometimes, out of habit, and he spins it in his palm like a coin when he thinks. I carry a stub of pencil in my apron and a scrap of paper folded twice. We are foolish in precisely the right ways. If I could put a hand on the shoulder of my small self, the girl with coal in her lungs and poems in her pocket, I would tell her what I know now. I would tell her that light doesn't always come from above. Sometimes it rises from the work of your own hands. I would tell her that grief will visit more than once, and each time you will think your house too small to hold it. And each time your neighbors will arrive with chairs and casseroles until the house grows by the square footage of their care. I would tell her that the plan in your pocket matters even if the pocket has a hole, and that you can line holes with hope the way you line bread pans with grease. I would tell her that a town can change its mind, that a mine can close and the sky remember how to be blue, that a breaker can become a library, that boys who once picked slate with bloodied fingers can lift books with hands that know their own worth. Most nights now before bed I open one of my notebooks. The oldest ones smell like the rooms where they were written: lamp oil, boiled coffee, damp wood. I read a page or two and then I set the book down and listen. The house makes its night sounds, the small tick of cooling metal, the hush of the curtains breathing with the window, and underneath those sounds is another, a memory I don't know how to spell, a wordless proof that everything we have loved stays somewhere like light in coal stored against the dark. On those nights I say the names softly: Father, Eli, Mother, the Wellers, Mr. Zielinski with his coal birds, Mrs. Sutter with her traveling library, Annie and her harmonica boy, Nora with her careful pies, May with her bright thread, Thomas with his patient wrench, James with his quick eyes, the children whose names filled a ledger of their own. and the names answer me in the silence, present as breath. If you've walked with me this far, perhaps you understand why I wanted to tell you all this. History is written in ledgers and laws, yes, but it is also written in lunch pails and broken laces and prayerful hands on glass. It lives in the way we pass a book to a child and say, "This is yours," and mean not just the book, but the world. It lives in the way a community closes ranks when the earth takes what it never promised to give back. It lives in a girl who thought the only light was the kind you strike with a thumb wheel and discovered another. The kind you kindle in a room so that other people can see themselves more clearly. Tonight or this morning, wherever you are, I wish you the ordinary blessings that make a life. Bread that fills the room with the smell of safety, work that feels like it belongs to your hands, laughter that returns even after it leaves, a sky honest enough to show you both its clouds and its stars. If you ever pass through our valley, you'll find me by the library or on the hill at evening, an old woman with a pencil in her pocket, watching the town remember and begin again and again. And if you listen closely at sunset, when the light goes copper and the grass holds still, you might hear the softest sound of all, the one that says that what we carried didn't break us, it burnished us, and we shine now not in spite of the dark, but because we found a way to walk through it together.